Tony Curtis stopped talking. Johnny Carson stood up from his desk. And America witnessed the quietest moment in television history. The band went silent. The audience held its breath. And for 17 seconds that felt like an eternity, nothing moved except Johnny Carson walking across the stage toward a man who had just broken in front of 40 million people. This is the story of the night The Tonight Show stopped being a show and became something no script could ever plan. How did we get here? It was March 1978. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late-night television. Every weeknight, Johnny sat behind that iconic wooden desk, delivered his monologue, bantered with Ed McMahon, and welcomed the biggest stars in America into his living room, which happened to be watched by the entire country. Johnny Carson wasn't just a host. He was a cultural gatekeeper. If Johnny liked you, America liked you. If Johnny laughed at your joke, your career was made. And if Johnny gave you that look, that slight raised eyebrow with the half-smile, you knew you just said something that would be remembered. But Johnny had another gift, one that didn't show up in the ratings or the headlines. He could read people. Not just their words, but their silences. The pauses between sentences. The flicker of something unspoken behind their eyes. And on this particular night, with Tony Curtis sitting across from him in that orange guest chair, Johnny's instincts told him something was wrong. Tony Curtis was Hollywood royalty. Handsome, charismatic, a leading man who'd starred in classics like Some Like It Hot and Spartacus. He'd been on The Tonight Show dozens of times. He knew the rhythm, the dance of late-night television. Make Johnny laugh, tell a good story, plug your project, wave to the camera, and go home. But tonight was different. Tony had walked out to thunderous applause, shook Johnny's hand, settled into the chair. The conversation started normally enough. Johnny asked about Tony's new film. Tony answered, but his voice carried a weight that wasn't usually there. Johnny leaned back in his chair, pen in hand, watching. Listening. Then Tony said something that changed everything. You know, Johnny, I lost my son. The studio went still. Johnny's pen stopped moving. Ed McMahon, always ready with a quick comment, said nothing. Doc Severinsen looked up from his music stand. The audience, trained to laugh at the right moments and applaud on cue, didn't make a sound. Tony Curtis's son, Nicholas, had died in a car accident just months earlier. He was 23 years old. Johnny didn't look at his cue cards. He didn't glance at the producer standing off stage. He didn't make a joke to ease the tension. He did something no one expected. Johnny Carson stood up from his desk. In 15 years of hosting The Tonight Show, Johnny almost never left his desk during an interview. The desk was his fortress, his control center. It was where he orchestrated the show, where he maintained the perfect distance between host and guest, between television and real life. But not tonight. Johnny walked around the desk. His footsteps echoed on the studio floor. The camera operators adjusted, unsure whether to follow him or stay on Tony. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Tony Curtis sat in that orange chair, his shoulders curved inward, his hands gripping the armrests. He wasn't the Hollywood star anymore. He was just a father who had lost his son and didn't know how to carry that weight. Johnny reached Tony's chair and did something that broke every unwritten rule of television. He sat down on the edge of Tony's chair. Not in his own chair. Not standing at a professional distance. Right there, next to Tony Curtis, close enough that the cameras caught both of them in the same frame. And then Johnny did something even more remarkable. He said nothing. Johnny Carson, the master of timing, the king of the perfect comeback, the man who could fill any silence with a joke, chose to say absolutely nothing. He just sat there. Next to Tony. Present. Human. Real. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. Doc Severinsen slowly raised his hand, signaling the band to hold. The musicians, trained to fill dead air with a musical cue, stayed frozen. The audience didn't cough. Didn't shift in their seats. Didn't whisper. 40 million people across America sat in their living rooms, watching a moment that shouldn't have been on television, and couldn't look away. Because this wasn't entertainment. This was witness. Tony Curtis began to speak again. Not to the audience. Not to the camera. To Johnny. His voice cracked as he talked about Nicholas. About the phone call that changed everything. About the guilt of being a father who couldn't protect his son. About waking up every morning and forgetting, just for a second, that Nicholas was gone, and then remembering all over again. Johnny didn't interrupt. Didn't redirect the conversation. Didn't try to make it lighter or easier or more palatable for television. He just listened. And then, in a gesture so small that the cameras almost missed it, Johnny placed his hand on Tony's shoulder. Not for the cameras. Not for the audience. Just for Tony. It was the moment when The Tonight Show stopped being a show and became a room where a man was allowed to grieve. The producers backstage were frozen. This wasn't in the rundown. There was no commercial break planned. No safety net. Just two men on a stage, one speaking from a place of unbearable loss, the other holding space for that loss without trying to fix it. Johnny finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but the studio microphones caught every word. Tony, I can't imagine what you're going through. But you don't have to go through it alone. That was it. No platitudes. No attempt to make sense of the senseless. Just an acknowledgement that grief is real, and that being seen in that grief matters. Tony nodded. Took a breath. And then, slowly, he straightened up in his chair. The audience began to applaud. Not the polite, cute applause of a talk show, but something deeper. A standing ovation that started in the front row and rolled backward through the studio like a wave. They weren't applauding Tony Curtis, the movie star. They were applauding Tony Curtis, the father. The human being who had just been brave enough to break in front of the world. Johnny stood up, helped Tony to his feet, and walked him back to the desk. They sat down together, and Johnny looked into the camera. We're going to take a break, Johnny said. We'll be right back. The camera cut away. But backstage, Johnny didn't move. He stayed with Tony. Talked with him quietly. Made sure he was okay before the show resumed. When they came back from commercial, Johnny made a choice that stunned the production team. He didn't bring out the next guest. He didn't do a comedy bit. He didn't try to reset the energy of the show. He just continued the conversation with Tony. Gentler now, lighter, but still real. They talked about Nicholas as a person, not as a tragedy. They talked about fatherhood, about love, about memory. And America watched. Not for entertainment. For connection. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The next morning, NBC received thousands of letters. Not complaints about the show being too heavy or too sad. Letters from parents who had lost children. From people who had experienced grief and felt, for the first time, that someone on television understood. One letter, preserved in the NBC archives, read, Last night, Johnny Carson reminded us that television doesn't have to be an escape from life. Sometimes it can be a mirror that shows us we're not alone. Tony Curtis would appear on The Tonight Show many times after that night. But he would later say in interviews that March 1978 was the appearance that mattered most. Johnny gave me permission to be broken, Tony said. And in doing that, he gave millions of people permission to be broken too. But here's the part of the story that almost no one knows. After the show ended that night, after the audience had left, and the cameras had been turned off, Johnny went back to his dressing room and found something waiting for him. A small envelope. Inside was a note from Tony Curtis. The note said, You didn't save me tonight. But you saw me. And that was enough. Johnny kept that note in the top drawer of his desk for the rest of his time at The Tonight Show. Whenever a guest seemed to be struggling, whenever an interview felt too polished or too rehearsed, Johnny would open that drawer and look at those words. You didn't save me. But you saw me. It became his guiding principle. Not to fix people. Not to make them funnier or more charming or more palatable for television. Just to see them. Fully. Honestly. as they were. And that's the legacy of that night in 1978. Not the ratings, though they were huge. Not the press coverage, though it was extensive. The legacy was a shift in what television could be. After Johnny Carson sat down next to Tony Curtis, other talk show hosts began to understand that vulnerability wasn't a liability. It was the most powerful form of connection. David Letterman would later say that watching that episode changed how he thought about hosting. Johnny taught me that the best thing you can do as a host isn't to be the funniest person in the room. It's to create a space where people can be real. Oprah Winfrey cited that moment as an influence on her own approach to interviews. Johnny showed that listening is an act of love, she said. Even Johnny's successor, Jay Leno, and later Jimmy Fallon, would point to that night as a masterclass in what it means to be present with another human being. But for Johnny himself, it wasn't about legacy. It wasn't about being remembered. In one of his rare interviews after retiring, Johnny was asked about the Tony Curtis moment. "I didn't do anything special," Johnny said. "I just did what anyone should do when someone is hurting. I showed up. I stayed. I didn't run away." The interviewer pressed. "But you walked away from your desk. That's not nothing." Johnny smiled. That same half-smile that America had loved for 3 decades. "The desk was just wood," he said. "Tony Curtis was a person. People matter more than television." The note from Tony Curtis, the one Johnny kept in his desk drawer, was eventually donated to the Smithsonian after Johnny's death. It's on display now, in the section dedicated to the history of American broadcasting. Next to it is a photograph of that moment. Johnny sitting on the edge of Tony's chair. Tony's head slightly bowed. The audience standing in the background, a blur of faces, all of them connected by the same human thread, the understanding that loss is universal, and that being seen in our loss is a gift. Underneath the photograph, there's a small plaque. It reads, "March 1978. The night the Tonight Show became more than entertainment. The night it became a reminder that television, at its best, is a mirror that shows us we are not alone." Years later, a young comedian visited the Smithsonian exhibit. He stood in front of that photograph for nearly 20 minutes. A security guard, noticing him, asked if he was okay. "I'm trying to learn," the comedian said. "Everyone talks about Johnny's timing, his delivery, his jokes. But nobody talks about this. About how he knew when to stop performing and start being human." The guard nodded. "That's why people still talk about this moment. Not because it was funny. Because it was real." The comedian left the museum that day with a new understanding of what it means to hold a microphone in front of millions. That the greatest power of television isn't to distract people from their pain, but to show them they're not alone in it. That same comedian would years later have his own late-night show. And on his first episode, he placed a small replica of Tony Curtis's note inside his desk drawer. Not for the cameras. Not for publicity. Just as a reminder of what matters. And that's the real story of what happened when Johnny Carson rushed to Tony Curtis on live TV. Not a scandal. Not a breakdown. Not even a dramatic television moment. Just 2 human beings, on a stage, in front of 40 million people, showing the world that it's okay to break. That grief doesn't have to be hidden. That vulnerability is not weakness. That sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply to see someone. Fully. Completely. Without judgment. And to sit with them in their pain, not to fix it, but to acknowledge it. Because that's what love looks like. That's what humanity looks like. And on that night in March 1978, America saw both. Johnny Carson taught us something that night that no comedy bit ever could. That the bravest thing you can do on television isn't to make people laugh. It's to let them feel. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe and leave a comment about a time someone simply showed up for you. Because people matter more than television. Always.